This week on To the Contrary, Bill Cosby's release from prison for his conviction on sexual assault charges and the future of the Me Too movement. Then, an historic first as a transgender woman is set to compete in the Tokyo Olympics this summer. Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. After 3 years in prison, 83-year-old Bill Cosby is free. He was released from prison after his sexual assault conviction was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The ruling was based on a technicality and decried as blatantly unfair by women's rights advocates. Cosby had admitted in statements given much earlier to a prosecutor saying he drugged and sexually assaulted women, but those statements were made under a grant of immunity. Later prosecutors used those statements to convict him in his latest case. More than 50 women have publicly accused Cosby of rape or assault. He was the first celebrity convicted in the Me Too era, and this case was one of the two most important convictions. With us today are Donna Edwards, former Maryland U.S. Representative, Patrice Onwuka, Senior Policy Analyst at Independent Women's Voices, Lara Brown, Professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, and Tiana Lowe, commentary writer for the Washington Times. And first to you, Donna. How big of an upset is this for the Me Too movement, given that despite that his conviction was overturned, a lot of Americans watched that trial and saw a guilty man?
Well, his conviction was overturned on a technicality, and I think it's really important to be clear about that. There is nothing that overturns the evidence that Bill Cosby engaged in the most egregious behavior, assault, drugging women, and that doesn't go away. And so this overturning of the conviction doesn't change the nature of the crimes that Bill Cosby was accused of.
Does anybody think it's a setback for the Me Too movement?
I think it's a little bit of a setback, but really a signal. You know, I think it tells there's some interesting parts of what made this kind of a technicality that he got off on. And I think in the opinion, the court recognized that bringing in witnesses who could not speak to the specific case, but to their past experiences, witnesses who, never brought, charges or investigations against the accused in the past. And, other people, just to kind of prove that he's got a bad character and maybe this is a pattern of evidence that may not fly in future cases. I do think that we talk about technicalities, but process really matters when it comes to the law. And when you're talking about someone who's being accused of, a pretty serious, heinous crime, you've got the prosecution. They've got to make sure their ducks are in a row because there are rights, and the accused have rights. And I think, whether or not you believe the allegations, what was done to Bill Cosby from the prosecutor's standpoint was not right.
Well, you're talking to at least one lawyer here, and I agree with you. It's all in the details with the law. Believe me, I corrected so many law review footnotes that in the real world, nobody would care about, but they spend your time as a law student learning to do that. But this technicality, it was time limited. The agreement not to prosecute was time limited. And if they had just waited a few more days to put forth these charges, they wouldn't have been violating the agreement. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, isn't the Fifth Amendment right to not self-incriminate? That doesn't really have an expiration date. I mean, the fact is, in good faith, prosecutors, even if they don't broker a deal with the suspect, but if they're just informing them of something that they will not do unconditionally, they're expected to be held to that. The issue that I see here is everyone's outrage is directed at the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court when really it should be at Bruce Castor, the district attorney who basically bought into every negative stereotype about women who accuse a man of sexual assault. And that's why he pushed the non-prosecution agreement, because he thought that her claim, which was very credible, very much backed by evidence, wouldn't stand in a criminal court because the jury couldn't understand that she was a legitimate victim. That's the real problem here. DAs who do not think that women's claims, even with evidence, will be taken seriously.
One of the biggest problems with the Bill Cosby case is just that so many women have not been able to come forward. And that is a problem of our culture. I mean, the truth of the matter is the statute of limitations were expired on so many of these instances. And what that meant was that prosecutors also never had sort of the full arsenal available to them to bring into the courtroom. And so while I agree that Castor should have done more in the original case and not entered into some kind of, plea agreement where Bill Cosby was able to testify in the deposition and then be waived from any prosecutorial, effort. It's also a problem that we've got dozens of women who were hurt and were not able to seek justice, partly because our culture didn't allow that. And this
wait, Lara.
I want to say this.
Our culture or our laws, which are two separate things.
Look, Bonnie, our laws reflect our culture. And what is really important is to understand that for most of American history, women have not been seen as credible. And the one thing that I think is true, and this is where I would say this is not sort of a backtracking on the Me Too movement at all. If anything, it tells us that the Me Too movement has changed the way women are seen. And what is important is that going forward, I think we are going to see more and more women who are more comfortable asserting the wrongs and transgressions that have been done against them in public and in courts of law.
Well, this is not, what do you say? I wouldn't even try to put this in evidence in a court of law, but it's just something I heard from a friend of my family who's a very big talent agent in Hollywood. And I asked him, 6 months or more ago, what's with the Me Too movement? Has it changed things? And he said, it's dead and not at all.
Well, the Me Too movement, though, Bonnie, come on. I mean, the Me Too movement was more than just about Hollywood. The Me Too movement was about individual women being able to come forward and to speak the truth of their experiences. And I think, if anything, the result in the Cosby case, I agree. The Supreme Court was going off of what the law is now and supposedly an agreement that was never written down between the prosecutor and Bill Cosby. But in fact, I think women should still feel that they can come forward, that there are prosecutors out there who will listen to them. And I think, if anything, the movement bolstered the ability of women to come forward and to speak the truth of their experiences.
But why aren't we seeing, and there are cases out there, I wish Hillary Rosen, our regular panelist, because she is very involved, she's on the board of the group that brings these lawsuits and pays for them for poor women, to tell us about more lawsuits coming forward, because they are. But my question is, if the publicity dies down, doesn't that give abusers a signal like, okay, we're gone, you can go ahead and do what you want to do now?
Well, Bonnie, I would hope not. I mean, I agree with Donna that women were empowered to share their voice, to share their story. I do think, though, that the Me Too movement became political at some points and became more of a tool for, certain party politics and policies, rather than being fully inclusive of, those who are on the right, for example. Now, does that mean that men can think that they can, and women who do sometimes harass and worse, do they? I think they're getting away. No, I don't think so, because I think social media has demonstrated that, what happens in the dark can come to the light very quickly, and cancel culture can be used to cancel your career. So there is still some fear of that. And unfortunately, the other side of that token is that we have seen in the professional world how the interactions between men and women have changed because of all of this, where a lot of men in power don't feel comfortable being around young women, for example. And that we've talked about this before on the show, that has some impacts on women's careers as well. So Me Too is, I'm not going to say it's bad. I think there's been a lot of positivity, but there also have been some unintended consequences that we conservatives always talk about.
I'll just say this. I think that it is clear that we need more resources that are able to help and support women, and so that they feel comfortable enough to be able to come forward and have the advocacy they need. And I mean, that has been, a real challenge, is women have had no support systems out there, and you feel like you're alone if you come forward to speak about what has happened to you and to pursue the legal avenues that are due to you. And so, if anything, it should cause us to redouble the kind of resources we have out there.
From overturned convictions to transgender women in sports. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal challenging the rights of transgender students to use the gender bathroom of their choosing. The High Court will not hear the case involving Gavin Grimm, a transgender boy, and a Virginia school board that didn't want him to use the boys' bathroom. Also, after winning the state pageant, Miss Nevada will become the first transgender woman in the Miss USA pageant in November. And this summer, the first transgender athlete is expected to participate in the Olympics. If all goes as planned, New Zealand's Laurel Hubbard will compete in women's weightlifting, but it's not without controversy. The issue is whether Hubbard has an advantage over the other women weightlifters because she was born a biological male. Joanna Harper, a medical physicist, athlete, and trans woman, says not necessarily according to her research, because trans women who undergo hormone therapy lose that male advantage. She first noticed it during her own transition.
I knew that once my testosterone levels started going down, I was going to run slower, but I thought, I'd lose a little bit of speed and it'd be a gradual change. But that's not what happened. Within weeks, I was running noticeably slower. After 9 months, I was running 12% slower.
The International Olympic Committee used studies, including Harper's 2015 groundbreaking research, to reshape regulations on transgender athletes. It dropped the original requirement for surgery, mandated in 2004, when the Olympics first made it okay for transgender athletes to compete.
A trans woman has to lower her testosterone below a specific level. It's 10 nanomoles per liter is the limit, and keep it there for a continuous period of 12 months before competing in the women's category. And then once she starts into the women's category, must maintain low testosterone continuously while she continues to compete.
Some scientists and activists criticize the guidelines. Donna Lowe is a former softball player and member of the Women's Sports Policy Working Group. Her organization is working on a compromise proposal to make it fair for both transgender and biological women to compete in women's sports. They offer a variety of options and believe it depends on the sporting event and the woman's transition status.
No matter what hormones you take, you can't get rid of the muscle mass that you developed when you went through puberty, and it's still an advantage.
The proposal would allow transgender women to compete in women's sports events, but in sports requiring greater muscle mass, they suggest different categories and awards. Classification would also depend on whether the athlete started hormone therapy before or after puberty, or never underwent therapy.
We've got to listen to science. The latest research on military tell us that we probably have to have transgender girls, for instance, stay on hormones for a longer period of time than was originally thought. That military research is saying it's probably more like 2 years. So there's still this flux. And the point is, can we do the best job we can to protect biological females and to make sure that all transgender women are welcome in women's sports?
Hubbard has performed better as a female weightlifter than as a male, coming in 6th place in the 2019 World Weightlifting Championships. And Harper says this isn't the most typical example of trans women in sports.
There are many, in fact, most sports where you're not even going to notice a difference between the performance levels of trans women in men's sports and women's sports. But weightlifting is one where, there's a quote unquote advantage. But we allow advantages in sport. But even with her advantage, she was 6th in the World Championships. How about we wait and see how she does it in the Olympics before everybody gets super excited about it?
All right, to you, Lara. A lot of people think that the reason some people are bothered by Laurel Hubbard competing in the Olympics is because she is competing in a traditionally male sport and one where very strong muscle mass is required. Do you think it would be different if she were competing in another sport?
Well, I think the science is actually still out on sort of which sports may have issues for transgender women in competing in traditional women's sports. There are questions about whether it's speed or whether it's the having gone through puberty as a male, as to how the biology of that individual is affected and whether or not it creates an unfair advantage for the cisgender or the cis women who are competing alongside these trans women. And I think, what we have to do is understand that all of sports involves biological differences to begin with. Some of the most extraordinary athletes just happen to also have biological advantages. We know that Major League Baseball players, for instance, have better than 20/20 eyesight on average. That's part of what allows them to hit those home runs so frequently. And this is where I think we have to have a much more robust conversation about biological differences in sports, what we understand to be good athletics and impressive abilities versus what we really see as a gender difference or a sex-based difference.
I take your point that science isn't even there yet very well. I think people need to pay attention to that. But the transgender community, and we know because we've covered this story in the past, always says, well, once you go on hormones, you lose your muscle mass, you lose all the advantages that you have. Tiana, do you think this is true? Do you agree with that?
So per Laura's point, the jury's still out on a lot of these issues. There are questions again of did the transgender female in question go through biological male puberty, bone density, all of these things? Yes, we do know that athletes often possess biological distinctions. Like, for instance, Michael Phelps's body proportions are closer to that of a fish than the average American male. So obviously he's going to have some physical advantage when it comes to swimming. But when it comes to any external influences that gives you a leg up, think about all of the athletes who unknowingly are exposed to a substance that shows up on a drug test that the IOC or whatever governing body for that sport says, any trace of it, you're done. Athletes have always been held to the most strict scrutiny when it comes to any external factors that could be seen as cheating or giving them an artificial leg up. when it comes to sports, it seems like the scientific consensus is not there. And it seems like, this is pretty much the last realm of Western civilization where we have a clear-cut male lane and a female lane. We do not have the male political contest and the female political contest. We do not have the male CEO contest and the female CEO contest. But with sports, we do. And think about this in terms of as it relates to Title IX in women's sports. Is it fair for biological women to have certain scholarship opportunities taken away from them by people that, if they weren't identifying as trans, if they were just taking substances for other reasons, would be viewed as cheating? And this has nothing to do with giving dignity and respecting the pronouns and the identity of transgender individuals. Of course, I'm in support of that. This is about the basic fairness of something that's very competitive.
Donna, do you agree? Do you support the traditional progressive view that transgender women are women and that's it?
Well, let me just say, first of all, I do not think that the science is out there yet. And so I don't think that we can go around making decisions about who gets to compete where without having some of that scientific background. And so with that in mind, I also think that we continue to overestimate and analyze what the nature of the problem is. It's estimated that only about 50 of 10,000 Olympic athletes fall into this category, and not all of them we even know because they're not out in one sport or the other. We also know that just because you're a super athlete in one sport does not mean that that same athletic talent translates into being a super athlete in another sport. And so there's so much more that we have to learn about this. And I think whether you're talking about the high school and college level, I think people should be able to compete as who they are. And I know that we've talked about this issue before, and I guess I just don't think that it rises to such a level that we're endangering women's sports or we're endangering men's sports by having people compete as who they are.
Your thoughts, Patrice?
Well, I think it would be nice. I think we all agree that the science is not conclusive, but schools are not waiting on the science. Sports is not waiting on the science. And so as we're seeing these athletes at the collegiate level, the high school level start to compete, this issue is not going to go away. And we can't, I think, underestimate it here. At our sister organization, IWF, we are soliciting stories from across the country, tens to hundreds of stories of young women who are competing with biologically male athletes in competitions and losing in competitions which they would have potentially have won. The real world consequences are these young women are losing out on scholarship opportunities, as Tiana mentioned. They're losing out on opportunities just to compete fairly. And I think when we talk to the public, I think people understand the argument of fairness. It's not so much a matter of denying someone the right to live their life as they choose. It's a matter of denying someone the right to compete fairly in a sport that's carved out for them. And I do actually agree also with Tiana that, yeah, women's sports are one of the few lanes that are still available to women. And I do think we have to be careful about erasing those lanes. The funny thing is we never see very much about women competing in men's sports. Why is that? For most women to compete in men's sports, they probably would have to take some sort of enhancement to be able to catch up. Otherwise, why do so?
Yeah, talk about, I do not know the answer to this question, but are there trans men competing in men's sports?
So Bonnie, maybe I could just answer this. There is a recent study that was just published in one of the British journals of medicine that actually did find that when trans men take the masculizing hormones, so mostly testosterone, in fact, over a year time, they are in fact able to compete at the same level as cis men when it comes to sit-ups and push-ups and speed in terms of running. So what was interesting—
Yeah, but what they don't have, because, most of them are not going to have because they were born biological women, is being 6 feet tall. As a lot of guys are 6 feet and over. Not a lot of women. It's pretty rare. So
no, it's true, but we may see more trans men try to move into men's sports. We've already seen a few women take the field in football, and I would not be surprised if we actually see more inclusivity in both sports. And maybe this would be a loss of the lanes, and maybe this would be in some ways a loss of the space that women have. But I do think this is, an eye-opening opportunity for all of us.
All right, that's it for this edition. Thank you all. Great show. Please continue the conversation with us on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.